Where did they get that from? Like,
Hello. Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon and good morning as well to Dr. Marta Benenti, who's joining us virtually from Italy right now, if I understand that correctly. Welcome back to the second installment of this semester's visiting lecture series here in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at the University of Macau. I've already mentioned the name of our visiting speaker today, Dr. Marta Benenti. So allow me to just say a few things by way of introduction before I hand things over. Dr. Benenti holds a PhD in philosophy from the University of Turin. Currently, she's the Mary Sklodowska-Curie postdoctoral fellow at the University of Murcia, where she is carrying out a project, LEAP, which is an acronym for Learning to Appreciate Aesthetic Values. Previously, Dr. Benenti held research positions in numerous places, among them the Italian Academy of New York, the University of Turin, and the San Raffaele University in Milan, as well as teaching positions at the Politecnico University of Turin. From 2021 to 2023, she was the postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Eastern Piedmont, where she taught aesthetics and philosophy of mind, while working on a project on the persuasive power of fictional narratives about climate change. And this might give you some sense of how the title displayed before you found its way into Dr. Benenti's current line of research. In addition to what you see before you, Dr. Benenti has also published on topics pertaining to expressiveness, emotions, the aesthetics of tourism, fiction, and the perception of aesthetic values. I'll hand things over to Dr. Benenti in a moment. Just before I do so, one procedural remark. In lieu of what would ordinarily be a post-event reception downstairs in the Port Club, I believe I'm not mistaken when I say that we will be relocating our reception to the picnic tables outside of E21B. Is that correct? I hope so. Where we will be having an outdoor gathering in the evening as a sort of informal welcome to our new postgraduate students, obviously, and unfortunately, Dr. Benenti won't join us, but we are still very grateful for your virtual presence here now. The title of Dr. Benenti's presentation is Fearing Climate Fictions, Emotions, Persuasion, and the Aesthetic Appreciation of Cli-Fi. Let's all give a round of applause and I'll hand things over.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Great, thank you very much, Ben, for this introduction and for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. I mean, my here is different from your here, but let's take the online space to be a shared one. As Ben was saying, this is part of my research, though this is not properly what I'm working at the University of Murcia now. But the nice thing that I want to mention before I start, just to frame what I'm going to say, is that preparing this presentation, I kind of realized how much the two projects that I'm carrying on are intertwined with one another and have overlappings between them. So I'm currently working on the processes that enable us to detect aesthetic features or aesthetic values in the environment and in artworks. But the thing that I'm going to present today has to do with another strand of research, that is the psychological persuasive impact that certain kinds of narratives have on recipients, on readers, and on watchers, because we're going to talk mostly about movies and novels. But the nice thing is that the step that I want to take forward in this strand of research that I'm going to present now, really, now I see it very clearly. It clearly overlaps with the problem of how we learn to detect aesthetic values. So let's see whether I can get to the end, and I hope I can make it. And I'll be really happy to hear your thoughts, comments, questions, criticisms about this project. So, climate fiction. Provided that I can go ahead with the presentation. Yep. So climate fiction. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the label Cli-Fi, which stands for climate fiction. In the last 2 decades, climate change has emerged as a dominant theme, not only in public discourse, but also in the artistic domain and in literature and cinema, above all. Such novels as Margaret Atwood's trilogy Mad Adams from 2013, Bacigalupi the Water Knife, Yamiki Will Solar are some of like the most famous works, or Friend of the Earth by Tom Boyle. Then you see The Day After Tomorrow, which is a very popular blockbuster. Interstellar, which is a bit more recent. Snowpiercer, there's both a movie and a TV show. The Waste Tide from Chinese writer. And these are just some examples. Now, these works have been labeled climate fictions, and this clearly patterns after the more established sci-fi, science fiction. The label has been vindicated in 2012 by Dan Bloom, which is a reporter and activist, and it's a label that tries to gather all those narratives that deal somehow with Anthropocene, the meaning of human life in the Anthropocene, the role of individuals and of communities within the ecological crisis time, ways of reorganizing people's lives in this era, the role of sciences and technology, the rights and duties that we have towards future generations, and so on. So why is this genre particularly interesting? Not only because it is timely, because it's something that has to do with our present, but for lots of reasons. And one of them has to do with the capacity that these works, even though they are works of fiction, so even though they make up words, have an impact on people's beliefs and attitudes and behaviors towards climatic issues. And this is even more interesting, given how elusive and difficult to grasp is the phenomenon of climate change. Just to mention one quite famous work by philosopher Timothy Morton, climate change has been named a hyper-object, which is an object so huge, so big, so overwhelming that it can only be grasped thanks to its multifarious instantiations and very different manifestations. And this is so, again, overwhelming that kind of, according to Morton, forces us to rethink our metaphysical and ontological categories. Moreover, it has been shown by empirical studies that it's very difficult for human beings to imagine climate change as something that is present. I mean, our tendency, when we are told that the worst things will happen in 50 years, is to remove the problem. We are not psychologically capable of figuring out that climate change is a real threat, because we tend to represent it as very far in the future. So there seems to be a huge temporal gap between this phenomenon, this hyper-object, and our present lives. And also there is another issue, that is the scientific relative inaccessibility of the problem. That is, it is very difficult to grasp, to understand, to learn from scientific records what's actually going on. I'm not saying that it's difficult to believe, I'm just saying that it's difficult to figure out and to really understand the phenomenon at stake. So given this background, Cli-Fi seems to be a very interesting way to come to understand something about this very, very elusive phenomenon. what I'm going to do, given this background, is I will try to circumscribe or to define the object of my research, that is Cli-Fi as a narrative genre. Then I will try to account for its alleged persuasive power. I will focus as a third step on the role played by negative emotions that are often elicited by this kind of narratives in recipients. And finally, I will suggest that there is something that we're missing when we try to assess the role of emotions in motivating our beliefs and actions. In the case of climate fictions, that is the aesthetic appreciation variable. Okay, Cli-Fi as a genre. In literary studies, me and my colleague Lisa Giombini, who's the person from the University of Roma Tre with which I'm working on this project and have been working on this project in the past couple of years, we found out that there is no agreement about whether Cli-Fi should be considered a narrative genre or not. Now, environmental catastrophes populate the history of literature. Think of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the story of Noah in the Bible, the Great Flood of Yu in China. However, Cli-Fi seems to be something that is strictly connected with another contemporary literary genre, which is science fiction. And according to some literary scholars, Cli-Fi should be considered as a subgenre of science fiction, not only because it shares with science fiction the same audience, for instance, the same expectation from readers and watchers, but because it is particularly concerned with scientific findings, post-apocalyptic scenarios, dystopias, the effects of technology, which are typical topics in sci-fi narratives. Others, like Malaysian scholar Adeline Jones-Putra, contend that Cli-Fi should rather be interpreted as a topic that can be found in many genres, so not a genre on its own, but rather the presence of Cli-Fi issues, of Cli-Fi features within science fiction, dystopia, fantasy, thriller, romance, narratives that do not straightforwardly belong to any given genre, like social or psychological fictions, that however deal with climate change. And finally, another position in this debate is that we should consider Cli-Fi as the narrative of the Anthropocene. That is, whoever writes a novel or shoots a movie nowadays is inescapably producing a work of Cli-Fi. I like to quote this phrase from Jeff Vandermeer, which is a very famous science fiction writer. He stated in an interview, "The entire time I'm writing, global warming looms over me and shines through me, and is all places, and in all ways is shining out and looming over. How can it not be in the subtext of much of what we write?" So in this case, the idea is that, Cli-Fi is everywhere in every narrative production nowadays because it's our present. So when dealing with this debate, we decided not to go too much into detail. I mean, we decided not to take a stand on this specific debate within the literary discussion, but we turn to a very helpful tool that comes from philosophy, and in particular from philosopher Kendall Walton. His seminal article of 1970, which is called Categories of Art, in which he suggests to distinguish between different arts, let's say painting, sculptures, cinema, novel writing, based on what he names standard features. A certain features of a work, according to Walton, can be considered standard if possessing that feature amounts for the work to belong in a particular artistic category. For instance, being three-dimensional seems to be a standard feature for being a sculpture, but at the same time, it is a contra-standard feature, so a non-standard features, or better, a feature that goes against the belonging of a certain work to a category. For instance, being three-dimensional is contra-standard for being a painting, because usually paintings are b-dimensional. Okay, so we decided to turn to this conceptual tool of standard features and to apply to our problem. So to the question whether Cli-Fi is or not a genre. And in doing that, we relied on a recent proposal by Italian philosopher Enrico Terrone, according to which we can use standard feature to define literary genre and not only to distinguish between artistic categories. In the sense, standard feature, I can hear, is it, okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, all good.
Okay, great. I could hear a voice and I didn't know whether there was something wrong there. Okay. So according to Terrone, so to Terrone proposal of applying standard features to literary and cinematographic genre, the idea is that standard features are not the essence of Cli-Fi, so this is not an essentialist definition. They do not necessarily appear together in the same work, so we can find these standard features that characterize a certain genre, but they're not necessary and sufficient condition for something to belong to a genre, for a work to belong to that genre. They're rather symptoms whose presence in a work helps us to include that work in a certain category, in our case, in the category of Cli-Fi. This dynamic notion of genre allows to venture a definition of Cli-Fi by means of its standard features. And again, this is a definition that remains quite open to the ongoing development of this label, which is relatively young, so inherently open to changes. So before I list what we propose to consider standard features of Cli-Fi, let me just remind you that the reason why I want to introduce the standard features has not much to do with the taxonomic intention, but rather with the aim of enabling our understanding of the particular nature of Cli-Fi, of this kind of works, and in particular, as I'll try to show later, of their capacity to persuade us of the importance of climate change. So the first feature that I want to mention is the presence of climate science. Most Cli-Fi works, we found, use science in order to scrutinize the meaning of global warming for human societies and non-human beings. Scientific models are sometimes entangled with the fictional vicissitudes, and very often scientists are among the main characters of this kind of novels and this kind of movies. Then we found out that a second feature that seems to be standard for the genre is climate change being not only on the background of these works, but playing the role of a determiner. The idea of the determiner is that climate change determines the plot, the story, the vicissitudes of the work. If we think about that in counterfactual manner, without climate change, that very story couldn't happen. So think about, I don't know whether you're familiar with this movie or TV show, Snowpiercer. In this case, climate change that has been caused by an attempt by human beings to reduce global warming that ends up in a terrible glaciation, really determines the way in which the story develops throughout. So people living on a train, turning very rapidly around the globe in order to survive. We can think about other stories like other movies, like think about quite old Blade Runner, in which we have the impression that, yeah, there has been an apocalypse there, something that has to do with climate change. There are huge deserts, incredible humidity within cities and things like that. But this appears just as a scenario. This appears just as background of the story, which could, in principle, unfold in different contexts. And in that case, we wouldn't consider Blade Runner as a Cli-Fi story because climate change doesn't play the role of a determiner. The third standard feature that I want to mention is that typically in Cli-Fi narratives, climate change has an impact on the lived experiences of the characters, their everyday life, their relationships, their mental health. Now, as I said, most Cli-Fi works exhibit a combination of 2 or 3 of these standard features. And although works in the genre typically possess at least one of these features, they can either belong to the genre despite not possessing any of them, or they can fail to belong to the genre despite possessing more than one of them. So again, this definition is quite open, and we should go case by case in order to see whether a specific work belongs to this genre. And actually, there are many borderline cases of fictional narratives whose membership in the Cli-Fi genre can't be disputed. We have had interesting discussions about, for instance, the movie by Christopher Nolan, Tenet, should be considered as Cli-Fi, and we think it doesn't. And other movies like quite recent Don't Look Up, in which basically climate change does never show up because the threat there is meteorites coming towards the Earth. Well, in that case, it seems to be clearly metaphorically a story about climate change and about the way in which science and journalists and communication and politics relate to climate change, but climate change never explicitly show up. So again, we can discuss whether that movie belongs to the category. Okay, so far so good. So I hope I have at least given some criteria to navigate recent narratives about climate change. What I want to do now is mention one further feature that characterizes climate fiction, but at the same time introduces us to the explanation of its persuasive power. This features is the functioning of climate fictions as thought experiments. And this feature is particularly crucial when we try to assess the persuasive power of Cli-Fi. Now, thought experiments, I'm sure most of you are familiar with what they are. We can define them very, very briefly as imaginative processes that allow us to get a grip on some aspect of reality by imagining first a setup scenario from which certain consequences are expected to follow. When we perform a thought experiment, or when we are invited by a narrative, by a story, by a philosopher to perform a thought experiment, we are asked to imagine a certain initial situation, a certain setup, a certain scenario. We're asked to visualize this context of departure, and to attend, so to say, to some consequences happening in the postulated scenario. which in principle should lead us to draw some conclusions. And typically, this is what is particularly important, such conclusions are meant to apply not only to the made up situation, to the imagined scenario, but also beyond the fictional context that is in the real world. So for example, the outcome of a thought experiment are expected to apply to theories that we have about reality, theories that we have about specific portions of reality, common sense assumptions concerning a certain state of the matter. A classical example of a thought experiment is a trolley problem. The idea is that we should imagine a scenario in which we are standing beside some train tracks, and in the distance we see a trolley that comes down the tracks towards 5 workers that are unaware of this danger. As the train approaches, we see a lever connected to the tracks. If we pull the lever, the train will be diverted to a second track away from the 5 people. However, down the side track, 1 person is standing. So the question would be, are we to pull the lever, killing 1 but saving 5? And as you probably know, there are many variations on this thought experiment. So again, what is interesting about this thought experiment is that, or what is interesting about thought experiments in general, is that we're asked to use our imagination to see what we would do in an actual situation in the real world. And this is supposed to challenge our ethical intuition in the case of the trolley problem, for example. Just like thought experiments, climate fiction invites us to engage in a certain scenario that usually involve the phenomenon of climate change. Not always, but typically it does. Like in thought experiments, imaginative engagement in Cli-Fi stories is such that the imaginer visualizes the described context, become absorbed in the story, and follow the development, adopting what has been called a quasi-observational attitude. We have the impression of being actually attending to facts that unfold in front of our eyes, or in front of what has been called the mind eye. By exploiting imaginative processes elicited by its narrative structure, Cli-Fi makes us see climate change rather than merely inviting us to think about it and its consequences. And then, much like thought experiments, most climate fictions have consequences that affect not only the world depicted by the narrative, but also our own views and expectation about reality, a reality in which climate change is real. Thus, we can argue that in virtue of their thought experiment-like structure, Cli-Fi works make it comprehensible for readers and watchers how certain implications of global warming would affect not only the lives of the character in the story, but their actual lives, their social, relational, and emotional dimensions. That is the world that they actually live in. Okay, I hope I have added a tile to the explanation of how climate fiction might affect our beliefs and attitudes. Let's set aside behaviors, but at least beliefs and attitudes towards climate change. While conceiving the narrative structure of Cli-Fi, as I have just done in analogy with thought experiments, while this allows to account for the way it engages recipients and drive them through the story as a thought experiment, I shall now say something about what we might call the mental or psychological underpinnings that are responsible for our responses to Cli-Fi reading and watching. Talking about climate fiction as a thought experiment helps us to outline the narrative structures of this kind of narratives, and to describe in detail the kind of what Walton called game of make-believe that is typical of these works. What is now to be said has to do with what happens, so to say, in our minds, if not in our brains, when we decide to accept to engage in this game of make-believe, when we accept to follow the thought experiment and to see what happens and to attend to the consequences. There is a quite widespread experience that I assume happened to all of us at least once in life, that is feeling totally absorbed, totally immersed in a story, losing track of time, forgetting about the world around us, feeling emotionally affected by the story that we are reading or watching. This phenomenon, again, whose phenomenology is quite familiar and quite widespread, has been named by psychologists narrative transportation. And very effectively, it has been described in particular by psychologists, by psychologist Jerrig, as a journey, because readers are, thanks to imagination, transported into the world that is depicted by the story. They leave some vicissitudes within the world of the story and then come back. And when they come back from the journey, they have somehow changed thanks to the experience that they have undergone. So they bring back something home from the journey. In other words, what happens is that thanks to narrative transportation, we seem to absorb at least some of the information that are conveyed by the novel. And this is something that is particularly interesting for us. So transportation is defined as a mental process whose main features, whose main constituents are the focus of attention towards the narrated world. So our attention is focused throughout the narrative to the depicted world. Another feature of narrative transportation is the emotional reactions to the narratives. A third feature is mental imagery, that is a specific kind of imagination that is triggered by narratives, and that is the specific kind of imagination that enables us to quasi-see features of the world, quasi-perceive what's going on in the imagined world. So typically, mental imagery is juxtaposed to propositional imagination. So we do not only imagine that things are happening in a certain world, we quasi-see that those things that are happening in a very vivid manner. And another thing that characterizes narrative transportation is the provisional loss of access to information that concern the real world. We sort of like forget about what we know it's going on in the actual world, because information concerning the made-up world of the story prevail, so to say, on what we know. As I said, this process is understood as producing changes in the network of beliefs of the audience, such that it may influence their disposition to behave and act in the real world. Okay, so we can zoom in and see exactly what happens when recipients are imaginatively confronted with fictional narratives concerned with climate change. And so we can see how specifically these kind of narratives interact with processes of narrative transportation. So first, that is this phenomenon that is called the reduction of counter-arguing. What's the reduction of counter-arguing? Based on the idea that criticism, that being critical toward the narrative, toward the story, toward an information that is conveyed, requires not only cognitive ability, so entertaining beliefs, knowing things, but also the motivation to retrieve and use those beliefs and knowledge. Psychology suggests that transported audience, so the audiences that are transported by narratives, may be less likely to dispute, to criticize, to question what is stated in the narrative than what is reported by a scientific paper, for instance. Why? Because interrupting the narrative flow to counter-argue, to question some of its features, to ask whether they're real or not, whether they are reliable information or not, would diminish the pleasure that one takes in being immersed in the narrative. And therefore, they require motivation to use one's knowledge, one's critical attitude against what has been narrated. In addition, since narratives are usually proposed with the intent to entertain, rather than to provide information or convey scientific truths, fictional narrative in particular are seldomly perceived by readers as attempts to modify their attitudes, to persuade them, to convince them of some truth. Therefore, they do not provide explicit invitation for critical thinking and counter-arguing, which results, at least partly or temporarily, inhibited. And this, applied to the case of climate fiction, seems to be especially relevant. This lowering of our cognitive resistance that is induced by the narrative may contribute to make recipients absorb this knowledge more easily, so the knowledge that is conveyed by the narrative. In 2004, for instance, this effect has been tested by psychology Anthony Lazarovitz using the movie The Day After Tomorrow. The aim of Lazarovitz's research was to test the hypothesis that representations of risk in popular culture can influence public perception of risk, even more than scientific risk communication. And so he submitted a survey to moviegoers before and after the show, and managed to demonstrate that the movie had a considerable impact on the perception of the risk entailed by global warming of the moviegoers. Overall, most watchers declared that they were more inclined after the movie to consider climate change as a national priority and to be willing to take action to reduce emissions and engage in action, being it personal, political, social action. So earlier on, I mentioned vivid imaginings and mental imagery. The idea is that narratives typically have the power to make narrated experiences look like real life experiences. According to Green and Brock, psychologists who coined the notion of narrative transportation, suggest that people, the transported audience, undergo quasi-perceptual experiences and have the impression sometimes of directly experiencing what they're only imagining. It has been observed that perceptual and mental imagery episodes, so vivid imagination, can be so phenomenally similar to real life events, that fictional events may be misremembered as real and give rise to real memories, so that people happen to mix up memories of real facts and memories of imagined or narrated facts. And this gives us an idea that as long as real personal experiences are fundamental in grounding our beliefs, it is reasonable to think that mental imagery elicited by these kind of narratives can do the same. So it can ground beliefs about the world, about real life. And there is an additional element that contributes to explaining the possible effects of narrative transportation in climate fiction. That is, that people tend to estimate the likelihood of a phenomenon based on their ability to imagine its occurrence. It is called availability heuristic, and Tversky and Kahneman are the most famous scholars who have worked on this. So studies in cognitive psychology have shown that the probability of events is usually assessed by people by the ease with which relevant examples of these events come to mind. So the easier an event is for us to recall in our minds, the more likely its occurrence will be estimated. For example, we tend to consider a car accident more probable after seeing a crashed vehicle on the road. So transposed to the case of climate change, we might feel more prompted to estimate the likelihood of climatic catastrophes after we have imaginatively attended to climatic catastrophes in a movie or in a novel. Third and last component of the phenomenon of narrative transportation has to do, unsurprisingly, with feelings, emotions, and processes of identification with characters that are depicted in a novel. Many empirical studies suggest that emotional attachment to characters of fictional stories has a central function in belief changes that are prompted by narratives. Those readers or those watchers who identify with a character, for instance, tend to feel the emotion that stems from the character's experience. They rejoice with them, with the fictional characters over their successes and suffering in the story. They empathize with them. And studies also attest that identification processes are fostered by the perceived similarity between the reader and the character, or the watcher and the character, with which they share worldviews, values, or ideology. And this is true for all narratives. This holds in all kinds of narratives. Interestingly, this is something I wanted to mention. Most of these studies, most of these empirical studies about narrative transportations do not distinguish between fictional stories and non-fictional stories. And so that it seems that this kind of phenomena, narrative transportations with all its features, is prompted by narrative structures more than by our awareness of the story being made up or the report of a real fact. Now, these processes of empathic identification can have important consequences in the specific case of climate fiction. For instance, identification can increase the recipient's perception of risks, but on a more subjective and interpersonal level, something that is more related, for instance, impact of climate change phenomena on family, relationships, emotions, feelings, psychological balance. And this is precisely the case for those climate fictions, and there is a growing number of these kind of fictions that focus on exploring the existential impact of climate change on the psychology of characters, more than on dystopian context, more than on apocalyptic scenario. So, because upon immersing oneself into the imagined universe of these works, we can understand how stronger our sentiment would be if we took the climate catastrophe more seriously. We're prompted by these narratives to put ourselves in the character's shoes and be more driven to reflect on how our family lives, relationships, as I said, bonds would be affected by this kind of threat. So, I think we can conclude that thanks to imaginative engagement triggered by narratives, when we attend to Cli-Fi stories, we are provided with a vivid image of the small-scale consequences of large-scale climatic changes. And taken all together, this overview supports the hypothesis that climate fiction might be an effective vehicle for cultivating an empathetic awareness of climate justice, an awareness that motivates us to act, to counter climate change. I would like now to take one last step forward before heading to the conclusion, which is very close. Now, the vast majority of climate fiction employs the disaster frame to depict climate change scenarios, which also reflects how we most often imagine and discuss climate change in non-fictional contexts. As a matter of fact, narrative engagement with these works is usually accompanied by feelings of discomfort, anxiety, fear. Therefore, one may think that negative emotions elicited by Cli-Fi contribute to foster pro-environmental beliefs and subsequent behaviors. And what is more, there are empirical approaches to such hypotheses that suggest that this is precisely the case, so that negative emotion or fear-inducing narratives prompt us to react in a more active way. And this clearly has to do with the dystopian origins of the genre. And again, as I said, with the way in which we discuss about climate change, typically as a disaster, as an apocalypse that is looming on us. And I here mentioned two experiments, and I'm not going into the details. Maybe I can tell something about this later. But both Leiserovitz experiment about the day after tomorrow and Schneider-Meyerson more recent experiment on reading short Cli-Fi stories seem to demonstrate that people feel prompted to act to counter climate change thanks to the negative emotions that are raised by these kind of narratives. So far, so good. But it is also true that 1 month after Leiserovitz's study, on the day after tomorrow, a follow-up survey has been carried out, and this follow-up survey showed that the audience's feelings of urgency about the need to take action had drastically decreased over time. And this upshot is very consistent with the psychological literature concerned with the so-called fear appeals in climate change public communication. This study suggests that negative emotion impair rather than foster climate-friendly behaviors. An increasing number of psychologists and sociologists suggest that fear-inducing or dramatic representation of climate change can be counterproductive when it comes to public engagement. More specifically, appeals to fear do have the power to attract audiences' attention, relying on features like, and I quote O'Neill and Nichols' paper from 2009, interestingness, unexpectedness, credibility, personal relevance, exaggeration, realism, sensationalism, and shock, and the capacity to break through the routine of everyday life. However, at the same time, such fearful representations that dominate public communication tend to distance and disempower individuals in terms of their sense of personal engagement with environmental issues. In other words, although people are initially struck by representations of climate change that trigger fear and anxiety, their reaction in the longer term include feelings of helplessness, remoteness, lack of control, and may result in people actively avoiding thinking about the issue. Worried about this mainstream doom and gloom style of climate communication, scholars and intellectuals from many disciplines have hypothesized that more positive accounts of climate change are more likely than catastrophic representation to motivate people's engagement. So recent studies on iconic representation of climate change in public campaigning, corroborated the view that promoting the exploitation of positive emotions when it comes to public campaigning about pro-environmental behaviors promises to be more successful. And we can think back on fictional narratives. It is reasonable to hypothesize that negative emotions elicited by Cli-Fi stories do play a similar role in influencing recipients' thoughts and motivations to action. So while anxiety and discomfort originated by narrative immersion in Cli-Fi stories might initially make us feel the need to do something about environment, they might as well result in doom, grief, helplessness, preventing us from taking action. And precisely with this hypothesis in mind, a quite recent study from 2019 tested people's responses to Cli-Fi, comparing their emotional reaction to catastrophic and to more solution-focused Cli-Fi stories. And the study showed that the latter, so solution-focused Cli-Fi stories that arouse feeling classified as hope, happiness, pleasure, amusement, were considered much more motivating than fear-inducing stories by most participants. And this has prompted invitation in the public debate to writers to write, more positive-oriented Cli-Fi stories. In the light of this mixed evidence about whether positive or negative emotions are more effective in soliciting climate-friendly behaviors, scholars have considered more subtle variables and have tested them. For instance, acknowledging the existence acknowledging the existence of differences among negative emotions. That is, fear is very different from sadness, melancholy is very different from despair, even though they are negative emotions. Some have proposed that a high degree of arousal is likely to activate us, whereas a low degree of arousal is likely to make us avoid the topic. And so on this perspective, the level of activation would impact on our behaviors towards the climate crisis more than the positive or negative valence of the emotion that is elicited. And consistently, it has been noticed that worry is a strong predictor of environmental policy support. Fear is not. Just to mention one further study, it has been suggested that we should look at the level of self-efficacy that representations of climate change make people feel. That is, the sense that one could make a difference through their behavior. The level of self-efficacy, of perceived and self-ascribed self-efficacy, may be determined in turn by the level of controllability that is ascribed to the phenomenon within the story, within the narration. If danger is presented as not externally controlled, then people will tend to avoid the issue. Accordingly, the emotional impact of climate change representation would depend not so much on the affective state that is elicited in recipients, but in the cognitive framework relating to the subject within which the emotions are provoked. And moreover, some methodological considerations have entered the debate, showing that fear, yes, it correlates with pro-environmental behaviors, but only when tested in laboratory, while more eco-valid settings show that this is not the case. So I take this mixed evidence to be telling at least two things. First, there seems to be no decisive evidence nor unanimous agreement on the power that the emotions elicited by the representations of climate change have of motivating us, our beliefs, our inclinations, our behaviors. And second, and focusing on climate fiction more specifically, this turns out to be not an easily accessible issue. That is, the emotional effects of reading novels or of watching movies might take very long time, thereby becoming very difficult to test. And this is something psychologists are very well aware of. This is why they usually test readers of short stories, not of novels. Moreover, individual tendencies, tastes, preconceptions, convictions are extremely impactful and difficult to measure when it comes to the reaction to this kind of narrative works. So what I want to do in this last 5 minutes is to suggest that there is one further variable that deserves our attention. And it is a variable that is admittedly hard to include in empirical tests, but I submit should guide at least our theoretical inquiry concerning the persuasive power of Cli-Fi literature. That is, I want to suggest that the aesthetic appreciation of Cli-Fi works could be crucial in determining readers' and watchers' disposition to deal with climate change. While it is very reasonable to believe that the emotion we feel after reading or watching a work of Cli-Fi play a role not only in shaping our beliefs about climate change, but especially motivating our behaviors, it is also relevant to consider the specificity of these objects, of these works. Because while public engagement campaigns are explicitly designed to raise awareness in the public, novels and movies are not. They are typically designed first and foremost to be aesthetically appreciated by the audience. And the possibility that they have any valuable impact on the recipient's worldviews or beliefs or behaviors should be taken as a side effect of their reception rather than the work's main goal. On this view, the appeals that I've mentioned earlier to writers and directors to realize less scary, less disquieting, less disturbing Cli-Fi works seem to misfire. For these appeals assume that the aim of such works is to provoke affective and cognitive reaction that can in turn prompt eco-friendly actions and behaviors. Now, acknowledging this premise doesn't imply to deny that there are works of Cli-Fi that have been created and conceived with the primary intent of persuading audiences. But we cannot reduce the scope of Cli-Fi novels and films to that of fostering climate activism. So, if we agree on the fact that as long as they're works of literary and cinematic fiction, works of Cli-Fi aim to aesthetically please their readers and watchers, then we can ask what role aesthetic appreciation plays in influencing their beliefs and behaviors. We can hypothesize, more in particular, a connection between the degree of aesthetic appreciation of Cli-Fi works and their capacity to raise people's awareness. That of aesthetic appreciation may become one of the variables to take into account when response to Cli-Fi narratives are at stake. Unfortunately, as you know, the notion of aesthetic appreciation is much debated, and there is little hope that the scholarly community will come to shared definition very soon. So I'm aware that it's not an easy task. What can be done, however, is to elaborate on what makes a work of fiction aesthetically valuable and on the relationship such value entertains with the emotions and with subsequent behaviors. Aesthetic experience of literary and especially fictional works amount to an aware focus on the aesthetic properties of these works. These properties emerge from the way in which what is told in the story is actually told. In other words, it is not so much the information that one may gain from reading a novel or watching a film that contribute to its aesthetic relevance, but the mode of presentation of such contents. And appealing to the mode of presentation doesn't amount to reduce the aesthetic value of narratives to style, but it entails a relational claim. In particular, following John Gibson, for instance, we can say that readers and watchers aesthetically appreciate stories so long as the way in which stories are presented offer them a meaningful perspective on human practices. In this sense, the aesthetic value of literary and cinematic works is not tied to the representation of particular individuals or situations with which readers and watchers empathize or identify themselves, or that they hate, and so on and so forth. It rather depends on the capacity that these works have to show their recipients human practice as meaningful and significant. To this aim, clearly style, form, linguistic choices, narrative choices, scenography, visual choices, again, do clearly contribute, but these features are not what aesthetic value is measured on. Rather, aesthetic values can be seized in the relation between such features and the way they convey meaningful worldviews to the audiences. So what I'd like to argue is that also the emotions elicited by fictional narratives that are aesthetically appreciated are deeply intertwined with the perspective these works offer on human practices. As such, their motivational power, so the motivational power of the elicited emotions, should be analyzed in relation to the aesthetic values that recipients experience as belonging to the work, and not just at the outcome of their inherent valence or arousal or a combination of these dimensions. Emotions generated by the immersion in narratives that turn out to be aesthetically valuable promise to interact with and to affect audiences' worldview more deeply. So regardless of the positive or negative valence of the elicited emotions, their impact on recipients' lives could be profound and long-lasting, rather than being limited to immediate short-term responses. And if this is true of all works of fiction, the next step of this Cli-Fi project should be to explore the specificities of Cli-Fi works. So as emerges from what I have presented, Cli-Fi narratives typically invite us to reimagine our way of inhabiting our own world, our own real world, thanks to their standard features, and to their being structured as thought experiments. We should thus try to reply to the question whether their specific nature that we have outlined plays a particular role in the process of aesthetic appreciation. Because should it turn out that Cli-Fi works in virtue of their nature and structure, demand particular appreciative aesthetic attitude, a new perspective could open up on the role played by positive and negative emotions in our behavioral reactions to aesthetically valuable climate fictions. Thank you.
So, Dr. Benenti, on your behalf, I'm happy to establish a queue of questions. That way you can just focus on the content of the questions, if that suits you. With that in mind, anybody who wants to enter the queue, feel free to raise a hand. Okay, we have a hand right at the gates. Let me hand you a microphone. Luke. That microphone's dead. One moment. Okay. This one.
Hello? Oh, great. Well, first of all, thank you so much. This kind of work is really fascinating to me and also definitely important for our historic moment. Something that I find really strange is that it seems very easy to imagine, possible apocalypses regarding climate change, but very challenging for us to actually imagine like a world order or a political economy that exists in that context that isn't also apocalyptic and dystopian. Could you maybe speak to how things like, hopeful narratives and sort of positive emotions might allow us to sort of breach that hole in our imagination such that we can actually start imagining things other than the end of the world?
I struggle a bit in hearing you, so just
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah, I'll speak up. Sorry.
try. Yeah, and just there is lots of noise here, so just yeah.
Gotcha. I guess in a nutshell, are you familiar with the joke that like it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism? Yes, given that. So why is it that in climate change narratives and narratives regarding sort of natural disasters or these stories that we're interested in Cli-Fi, why is it that it seems to be so much easier for us to imagine total disaster scenarios than it is to imagine something like a new political economy that prevents such a thing or that can transpire afterwards such that we're not all suffering in a dystopian society?
Okay, let me see if I got the question. I'm so sorry. It really depends on the noise that I hear here. So the question is whether or why should representation of climate fiction that are closer to our individual everyday lives should be more effective than that works that portray future societies with new political organizations, something like that.
I guess the gist of it is, why does it seem so much harder to imagine like a happy narrative like this as opposed to like a really disastrous one? Because there seems to be a reason that we are drawn to these despairing narratives, right? We see people, and not just with climate change stuff, like in America, people are sort of livid and riled up for, a civil war, we're ready for it. Oh, we want to imagine the end so badly. But same thing with climate change, I feel. Like, why is it so hard to imagine something?
Okay. Okay, thank you. No, okay, I see the question. So I think this is a super interesting question. I think we can go like two directions in order to give an answers, even though I don't have an answer. But I think that we have two directions to go. So one direction would be to look at the psychological mechanisms that are in play when we imagine the future. So the question would be, what in our specific psychological structure prevent us from imagining positive futures and make us appreciate so much, at least within the aesthetic domain, or at least within the artistic domain, to imagine dystopian futures. And the other way would be, let's look at our cultural production, right? So how used we are to the representation of dystopian futures, and how this habit that has been cultivated throughout our history influence our aesthetic, literary, cinematographic, narrative preferences. And I think that both paths are worth going. What I would like to add, even though I'm not sure whether add so much, but it is true that there is something with negative emotions elicited by fiction that has particularly positive impact on our psychological well-beings. We can think about Aristotle's theory of catharsis. We need fiction in order to practice negative emotions and to feel them and to get rid of them, to learn how to deal with them in the safe domain of fiction, in order to be able to deal with them in real life should bad things happen. And so I think that this might be a way to go in order to see why we like threatening and fearful futures so much. Does it partially reply to your answer? To your question?
It's appreciated.
I'm not seeing any other hands at the moment, so if people are still working on articulating questions of their own, maybe I will exercise the tyranny of sharing. Oh, okay, never mind. Maybe I'll go after you, Electrix. Why don't you go ahead? Just waiting to get the mic over. And be sure to try and speak up in case it helps with the audio. Thanks.
My first question is if imagination can influence our belief like real life, does it mean that imagination is an important part of how the mind constructs our belief? Or does imagination only have an impact on beliefs in certain specific situation?
Okay, thank you very much. And this is a big question as well. So I think different people would give you different answers, of course. And there are people arguing that imagination is something that we exercise in a secluded manner, so only in certain situations. And in this sense, the way in which imagination influences our beliefs is specific and it's not pervasive. And there are other people claiming that imagination is pervasive. And in this sense, imagination is multifarious. We have propositional imagination, we have mental imagery, we have counterfactual imagination. So imagination is a huge umbrella term that gathers several mental processes. And if we buy into this view, we can reasonably argue that imagination plays a crucial role whenever we form beliefs about the world. And I personally kind of like this idea because it allows to make sense of lots of weird ways in which we form beliefs. Think about superstition beliefs, think about religious beliefs, think about lots of beliefs that we find out being irrational. They seem to share a structure with standard beliefs, but at the same time not responding to our rational criteria. And in this case, accounting for at least some of these beliefs, relying on imagination, which has partly different rules, help us make sense of this kind of, mental processes and outcomes. On the other hand, it is also true that it is worth preserving, at least theoretically, some distinction between what is to imagine, what is to believe, especially when it comes to fiction, because take the case of climate fiction, lots of the information that are conveyed by climate fiction turn out to be scientifically not reliable. And it would be, even though we know that thanks to the reduction of counter-arguing, thanks to narrative transportation, we end up being more inclined to believe some of the information that are conveyed by these stories. It would be weird to argue that we rely on this information in the same way in which we rely on the information that are provided by science. This is not to say that we can do this, but this is not the paradigmatic way in which we deal with this kind of source of information. So I think that we should preserve a distinction between the way in which imagination works in these two distinct paradigmatic cases. So when we learn from fiction and when we learn from scientific reports, so to say.
Yes, thank you.
I might ask something about transportation and its relationship to belief. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay, so I take it that part of what you were articulating as you got into the difference later in the talk between, hopeful climate fiction narratives and more pessimistic ones, was that, these different kind of emotional valences that a Cli-Fi narrative can have an effect on like how deeply transported somebody is in a narrative. Like, is that at least part of the idea? I guess, even if not, I suppose what I was really asking or hoping to ask was about what you might know or be able to speculate about how sticky the beliefs are, I suppose, that are induced by being transported into a narrative. So I can understand transportation as explaining well enough how somebody might come to believe something as one is actually going through the narrative or experiencing the narrative. So I can understand transportation, therefore, as helping to explain like occurrent belief. But then, once one is no longer engrossed in the climate fiction, maybe the movie is ended or the book has been put down, and one starts going about their daily life. Is there data, like empirical evidence maybe, or something, or some sort of speculative, philosophical, psychological argument you could give for why we should expect the initial effect that transportation has on belief to also be like stable over time? So that somebody who, when they were in the grips of that climate fiction, were caused to believe this or that, maybe those beliefs actually are likely to stick around after the fact.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. That's a great question. So, so there are studies about the short duration of the beliefs, or better, not beliefs, but inclinations that come out of reading novels or watching movies. And I mentioned the example of Lazarovic's study about The Day After Tomorrow. Right after the movie, people were like, oh my God, climate change is real. We have to do something against that. And we have to vote, for those who have like the most convincing strategy to deal with global warming. And a few months after, this feeling of urgency to act had dramatically decreased. So the idea is that what you bring with you after the journey is more kind of like an inclination to believe, an inclination to act, to react, more than stable, as you said, beliefs. And I think that this is the reason why we wanted, I say we because my colleague Lisa Giambini and I wanted to focus on the emotional side of the story, because it is not so much an issue of what you learn from fiction, even though there is a huge debate on this, not so much what you learn from climate fiction about what's real climate change, but it has more to do with emotional or feeling dimensions. That is something that is more that turns out to be relevant when we form our beliefs, when we decide how to act, but it is clearly not subject to rational scrutiny and to fact-checking as our beliefs are, right? So again, this is why I think it is worth focusing on the motivational power of emotions, and this is why the recent research, so this is why I looked at the empirical literature about public communication about climate change, because they are the people who are looking at how emotions motivate our actions. And I don't think that there is evidence about, there is like, you know, knockdown evidence about positive emotions motivating us more than negative emotions. As I tried to show this mixed evidence, there are several variables that enter into play, very difficult to test. And this is why I think that we need something more when we talk about literature and cinema, when we talk about the arts. And when we talk about literature and cinema, I think that emotions play a relevant role. But they are relevant so long as they are intertwined with aesthetically relevant experiences. Sorry, I think I kind of recap the conclusions of the work, but just because I think that your question kind of helped me to say that something about why beliefs are not so much present in this research. You know, sticky beliefs are not really what we are discussing about.
Right. Yeah, no, that's very helpful. Okay, we have another question here. I'm going to hand the mic over.
Thank you very much. My question is somehow, related to Ben's question. It's somehow a follow-up. I mean, if the underlying question here or the overarching question is if literature can or art can change the world, right? If we could put it in this kind of gross way, I'm thinking because obviously this is not my field. I'm really interested in your in what you have to say, since you are an expert on this. If there are studies which situate this problematic in an economic, social, political context in which these kinds of narratives and these kinds of aesthetic experiences actually function in the opposite way, in an appeasing way. They function like pacifiers and not as like awakening, let's say, mechanisms. They rather are like fables that we read and we tell ourselves, or we go through some roller coaster experience reading, let's say, right, about some dystopia, but then the roller coaster is over and then we go home, especially in this context where everything is about our entertainment, right? Where entertainment is commercialized so much, right? And so much money is made out of our entertainment. So the end product, whatever aesthetic experience we may have, is some kind of pleasure, after all, like some kind of either, a pacifying effect or a kind of ironic affirmation of the status quo. In the way, let's say that, I don't know, even to put it more harshly, like you are familiar, of course, Panem at circenses, like bread and circuses, right? Like the Roman way of keeping the people, let's say, right? So yeah, that would be my.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's just, I think that this relates a bit to the issue of, like I mentioned Aristotle before, this idea of catharsis. I mean, you need fiction in order to deal with the negative, right? And but then I think that is kind of I think that is the intuition behind this idea that, wait, not every experience of fiction, not every experience of climate fiction is an aesthetic experience. That is, not every experience of fiction is an aesthetically valuable experience. And I'm aware that there is no shared definition of what an aesthetic experience is, but I want to go with a definition that says that, you know, an aesthetic experience is not only entertaining, it's not only a pleasant experience, it's an experience that, in principle, transforms you. It's an experience that offers you a worldview as a meaningful worldview, and that in principle might challenge your own worldview. And in this sense, I would like to say something extremely trivial. And now I'm sorry to having accepted the recording of the presentation. I would like to say that literature will not change the world, but it would be nice if good literature could change people. So it would be nice to have a good theory of the capacity that aesthetically relevant works of fiction interact with our worldviews in a meaningful way, potentially transformative. But again, this might be kind of wishful thinking. And again, regretting that this all is recorded, but what I encountered while reviewing many of these works of fiction that are Cli-Fi, I mean, I encountered lots of pieces of entertainment and very few works that promised, I don't want to say, I mean, it's really more complicated than this, but there is way more entertainment than aesthetic research in many of these works. And I think that, and again, I think that there is something there that should make us think about the nature of literature and the nature of cinema as artistic products. I know this sounds extremely conservative. I know that we should keep on talking for long, but I think that there is this intuition like behind this proposal.
Thank you very much.
Well, that brings us, I think, to a natural concluding point. Perhaps we could all do the courtesy of thanking our speaker one more time before we conclude today.
Thank you. I'd like to be there.
Yeah,
Honestly.
joining us. It's a shame, of course, that you can't just magically transport yourself to Macau for the reception that I hope the rest of us will attend. But at any rate, thank you again, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye. Thank you.
Yeah. Take care.